Please, don't leave me here. I'll cook, clean, I'll be anything you need. The desperate words echoed across the dusty ranch as the stoic rancher simply nodded, his face revealing nothing of the decision weighing on his weathered heart. The fate of someone's entire existence hung in the balance, suspended between mercy and practicality, as the vast, unforgiving landscape stretched endlessly around them. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. In the fading light of a chilly October evening, John Smith tied his horse outside the general store in Copper Bend, the animal's breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. Frost had already begun to claim the dirt streets of the small Texas town, crunching beneath his worn leather boots as he made his way toward the weathered wooden storefront. His tall frame cast a long shadow across the ground, his face partially hidden beneath the brim of his hat. The rancher had ridden into town for nothing more than basic supplies, flour, coffee, ammunition, necessities, to see him through another week of solitude on his land outside town. What he found instead was Mary Johnson, a woman he'd never seen before, her coat torn at the shoulder and hanging loose around her thin frame. Her cheeks were flushed pink from the cold, hair escaping from what had once been a neat arrangement. But it was her eyes that stopped him, wide, desperate, and burning with a determination that seemed at odds with her fragile appearance as she suddenly reached out and clutched his sleeve. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening wind that swept down the main street. "We've nowhere to go." Her fingers trembled against the rough fabric of his coat, but her grip remained firm, as if letting go meant surrendering to something worse than death. Behind Mary, whispers rippled from the saloon doors across the street, where several men had paused their evening revelry to watch the unfolding scene. Their murmurs carried fragments of her earlier pleas to others who had already refused her. The townsfolk of Copper Bend weren't known for charity toward strangers, especially women traveling alone. A few paces back, her younger cousin, Sarah Johnson, hovered uncertainly. The girl couldn't have been more than 17, her thin shoulders hunched against the cold, eyes darting nervously between her cousin and the strangers watching from the saloon porch. Unlike Mary, whose desperation had hardened into resolve, Sarah seemed brittle with fear, as if the next harsh word might shatter her completely. Between the two women and the gathering darkness stood only a broken-down wagon, its wheels splintered beyond repair, the horse that had pulled it looking as exhausted as its owners. John could see their meager possessions piled inside, all that remained of whatever life they'd left behind. As night approached, the temperature would drop well below freezing. The rancher's eyes moved from Mary's face to Sarah's trembling form, then to the curious onlookers whose interest would soon turn predatory once darkness fell. In Copper Bend, nightfall transformed the town, and women alone rarely found mercy in its shadows. "Please, don't leave me here. I'll cook, clean, I'll be anything you need." Mary Johnson gasped, her voice trembling but her grip unwavering on John's sleeve. The desperation in her plea hung in the frosty evening air of Copper Bend, cutting through the distant piano notes drifting from the saloon. John Smith studied her face, weathered beyond her years, yet fierce with determination. His silence wasn't from indifference, but careful consideration. The rancher's eyes flickered toward Sarah, who stood shivering nearby, clutching their only remaining bundle of possessions. The younger cousin's gaze darted nervously between the gathering shadows and the men lounging outside the establishment, their intentions becoming clearer as night approached. "We had nowhere to go after our wagon broke," Mary continued, lowering her voice. "The axle snapped clean through. They're asking prices at the hotel we can't possibly pay, and the church is locked until Sunday." Her fingers tightened on his arm, the thin fabric of her coat revealing how unprepared they were for the Texas winter. John knew what happened to women alone in frontier towns after dark. He'd seen it before. The predatory offers of shelter that came with unspoken demands, the disappearances explained away by morning. His ranch lay 7 miles outside town, isolated and spare, but safe from the dangers that prowled Copper Bend's streets. He cleared his throat, unused to speaking much. "Got work that needs doing," he finally said, his voice rough from disuse. "Not running a charity." "I've worked farms before," Mary countered quickly. "Sarah has a way with horses. We'll earn our keep." The rancher's gaze swept over the street, noting Robert Brown watching from his store doorway with too keen interest. The storekeeper had been eyeing the women since they'd arrived, offering arrangements that made John's jaw tighten. After what seemed an eternity, John gave a single decisive nod. No smile, no promises, just that firm, wordless commitment. Relief flooded Mary's face, though wariness remained in her eyes. Sarah stepped closer, her thin shoulders straightening slightly. "Get your things," he instructed, turning toward his horse. "We ride before dark." As they gathered their meager belongings, John felt the weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders. These women were strangers, yet something in Mary's fierce dignity resonated with his own solitary struggle. That simple nod had altered 3 lives irrevocably, binding their fates together on the untamed Texas frontier. The moment carved itself into all 3 hearts as they mounted up and rode away from town, the setting sun casting long shadows before them. The crimson-streaked sky guided their way as John Smith led the 2 women across the open prairie. The rancher rode slightly ahead, his broad shoulders squared against the wind, while Mary and Sarah Johnson followed on the back of his wagon. Every jolt of the wooden vehicle sent shivers through their bodies, their thin coats offering little protection against the biting October chill that swept across the Texas plains. Mary pulled her cousin closer, trying to shield the younger woman from the worst of the wind. Her thoughts raced between gratitude for John's intervention and anxiety about what awaited them. The silent man had barely spoken 10 words since they'd left Copper Bend, and uncertainty hung between them heavier than the approaching night. "There it is," John finally said, gesturing toward a collection of buildings that materialized on the horizon. The ranch appeared like a fortress against the darkening landscape, not grand or imposing, but solid and purposeful. A 2-story wooden house stood flanked by a weathered barn and corral, all surrounded by stretches of fenced pasture. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth that both women desperately craved. As they approached, Mary noticed the careful order of the place. Unlike other homesteads they passed in their travels, John's ranch bore no signs of neglect. Every fence post stood straight, tools hung in precise arrangements, and even the woodpile was stacked with methodical precision. Inside the house, a simple hearth dominated the main room. John lit several lamps, illuminating sparse but functional furnishings. A wooden table with 4 chairs, a bookshelf with worn volumes, and a rocking chair that looked rarely used. "You'll sleep upstairs," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "There's a spare room with a bed big enough for both of you." Before either woman could thank him, he continued, setting down his rules with the same directness he'd shown in town. "Everyone works here. I don't carry those who won't pull their weight. You'll earn your keep or find somewhere else." His eyes, though not unkind, remained firm. "Trust is earned by sweat on this land. No exceptions." Mary felt her spine stiffen at his tone. Despite her desperate plea in town, she was no beggar content to be reminded of charity. Her chin lifted slightly, pride flickering across her features. "We understand," she replied, matching his directness. "We're not afraid of hard work, Mr. Smith." A hint of surprise crossed John's weathered face at her response. He nodded once, seemingly satisfied. "We'll start at dawn," he said, then showed them to their room before retreating to his own quarters. That night, as Sarah slept beside her, Mary stared at the unfamiliar ceiling. Tomorrow would test her resolve, but the determined glint in her eyes remained undiminished. This ranch might be their sanctuary, but she would make it clear they would earn their place, not beg for it. Sarah Johnson gravitated toward the corral on her second morning at the ranch. While Mary slept, exhausted from the previous day's journey, the younger cousin slipped out at dawn, drawn by the soft nickering of horses. Her approach was cautious but confident, extending a steady hand toward a chestnut mare who eyed her warily. "You're good with them," John observed from the barn doorway, his voice startling her. Sarah didn't flinch. "My father kept horses before he passed. Said I had the touch." She ran her fingers through the mare's mane, demonstrating a skill born of instinct rather than training. The rancher nodded, offering her a worn leather brush. "The bay gelding needs attention too." It wasn't charity, it was an assignment, and Sarah recognized the difference. By midday, she had curried 3 horses, her quick movements and gentle murmurs earning their trust faster than John had seen before. Meanwhile, Mary insisted on tackling the household tasks with fierce determination. When John returned from checking fence lines, he found her scrubbing the wooden floor, her knuckles raw and bleeding. "You don't need to," he began. "I do," Mary cut him off, her voice firm despite her obvious fatigue. "We made a deal." She rose to her feet, wincing as she straightened her back. "I keep my promises, Mr. Smith." The first week passed in uneasy silence. The cousins shared whispered conversations at night, wondering about their taciturn host. "Do you think he regrets taking us in?" Sarah asked, her voice small in the darkness of their shared room. Mary stared at the ceiling. "Maybe. But regret won't make him break his word." Their gratitude came tangled with pride and suspicion. They'd known hunger too intimately to trust comfort easily. Each morning, Mary woke before dawn to prove her worth, cooking, cleaning, mending torn shirts with stitches so fine John barely noticed the repairs. For her part, Sarah's natural affinity with the animals transformed the daily chore of feeding and watering into something approaching joy. The horses responded to her, even the stubborn stallion that had bitten 2 ranch hands the previous season. John observed more than he spoke. He noticed how Mary flinched when he moved too quickly, how Sarah's eyes darted to exits when voices were raised. But he also saw their strength. Mary's hands blistered but never idle, Sarah's quiet competence with tasks she'd never been taught. On the 7th day, when Mary served a stew made from precious stores she'd stretched with foraged herbs, John broke his usual silence. "You both belong here," he said simply, not looking up from his plate, "for as long as you want." The words hung in the air, neither a demand nor a plea, just a truth, offered like bread to the hungry. The howling wind rattled the windows of John Smith's ranch house as midnight approached. Inside, Mary Johnson had just finished mending a torn shirt by lamplight when the first sounds of trouble reached them. Drunken shouts and the thunder of hooves approaching from the direction of town. Sarah looked up from where she'd been brushing down a saddle. "What's that noise?" she asked, her young face tightening with concern. John rose from his chair in one fluid motion, his weathered features hardening as he moved to the window. "Stay inside," he ordered, reaching for his rifle that hung above the door. The rancher checked the chamber with practiced efficiency. "It's those men from the saloon," Mary whispered, peering through a gap in the curtains. She recognized the ringleader, a burly drifter who'd been eyeing her and Sarah in town earlier that week, asking pointed questions about the pretty new girls at Smith's place. 5 riders pulled up in the yard, whiskey bottles glinting in the moonlight. Their leader dismounted, stumbling slightly as he approached the porch. "Hey, Smith," he bellowed. "We heard you're keeping those Johnson girls all to yourself. Ain't neighborly." Crude laughter erupted from his companions. One of them added, "Just want to pay our respects to the ladies." Mary felt her throat tighten as Sarah gripped her arm. They'd faced unwanted attention before, but here in the isolation of the prairie, miles from any help, the threat felt immediate and overwhelming. The front door opened with a creak. John stepped onto the porch, his tall frame silhouetted against the light from inside. He said nothing, simply leveled his rifle at the group, its barrel catching the faint moonlight. "Now hold on," the leader slurred, raising his hands. "We're just being friendly. Get off my land." John's voice was low but carried across the yard like a physical force. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then one of the riders muttered something about Smith being crazy enough to shoot, and the group began to back away. Their bravado dissolved under the rancher's unwavering gaze and steady aim. After they'd ridden off, cursing and shouting empty threats, John remained on the porch until the sound of hooves faded completely. Mary joined him outside, wrapping her shawl tightly against the biting wind. "They'll be back," she said quietly. He nodded once, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "I thought we'd be safe here," she continued, her voice barely audible above the wind. "But nowhere truly is it?" The rancher finally looked at her, his eyes reflecting something beyond his usual stoicism. Concern, perhaps even regret. "Not on the frontier," he admitted, "but you're safer here than alone." Mary stared out at the vast darkness surrounding them, suddenly aware of how small and vulnerable they were. 3 people in a wooden house on the endless Texas prairie, with only themselves to rely on when trouble came calling. The first snow of winter brought a somber silence to the ranch. John Smith stood at the threshold of his home, his weathered face etched with concern, as he explained to Mary and Sarah Johnson that he had to drive the cattle south. The Chisholm Trail would be his path for the next 3 weeks, a necessary journey to ensure their livelihood through the harsh months ahead. "You'll manage," he said simply, his voice carrying more faith than question. Mary nodded, her hands clasped tightly at her waist to hide their trembling. This wasn't what she had bargained for when she'd grabbed his arm in desperation outside the general store. But she wasn't about to show weakness now. The morning of his departure arrived with bitter winds that cut through clothing like knives. Sarah helped the rancher secure the last provisions to his horse while Mary stood watching, memorizing his instructions about the property. When John finally mounted his horse, he looked down at the 2 women, no longer strangers, not quite family, and tipped his hat before riding away, a solitary figure against the vast Texas horizon. The first days alone were the hardest. Mary woke before dawn, her body aching from unaccustomed labor as she trudged through snow to feed the remaining livestock. Her cousin took to caring for the horses with natural skill, whispering to them as she brushed their coats and checked their hooves for ice. "We're doing it," Sarah remarked one evening, her cheeks flushed with cold and pride as they sat by the fireplace. "We're actually running this place ourselves." The work transformed Mary. Each morning found her more determined than the last. She learned to mend broken fence posts, to judge when a storm was brewing by the smell of the air, to haul water from the well without spilling half of it across the yard. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused and strong, badges of honor rather than marks of servitude. Townspeople rode by occasionally, curiosity thinly veiled as neighborly concern. Robert Brown from the store lingered longer than necessary during a delivery, his eyes following Mary as she confidently directed where to place the supplies. "John chose well when he took you in," he commented, his tone suggesting something Mary chose to ignore. "We chose each other," she corrected firmly, "as business partners of a sort." As the weeks passed, the empty house gradually filled with something unexpected: hope. Sarah's laughter, absent since their desperate arrival in Copper Bend, echoed through the barn as she trained a skittish colt. Mary found herself humming while kneading bread, planning improvements to the vegetable garden come spring. When they spotted a lone rider approaching one crisp afternoon, both women stood straighter, stronger than they had been when he'd left, no longer seeking shelter, but standing their ground as if they belonged. The dawn broke with an ominous stillness that Mary Johnson recognized all too well. Growing up in the Texas plains had taught her to read the sky's warnings. A yellowish haze hung on the horizon, advancing toward the ranch with frightening speed. "Sarah, secure the barn doors," Mary called, her voice cutting through the eerie quiet. She grabbed her cousin's arm, pointing to the approaching wall of dust. "We've got minutes, not hours." Sarah Johnson nodded, her usually bright face tightening with determination as she sprinted toward the barn. The young woman had developed a natural way with the horses during their months at John Smith's ranch, and now that bond would be tested. The first gust hit like a physical blow, nearly knocking Mary off her feet. She wrapped a damp cloth around her face and pressed forward, squinting against the stinging particles that seemed to find every exposed inch of skin. The air thickened until breathing became a struggle, each inhale bringing the taste of earth and desperation. Inside the barn, the horses whinnied in panic, sensing the danger before it fully arrived. Sarah moved among them with surprising authority, her gentle hands and soothing whispers calming even the most skittish animals. "Easy now," she murmured to John's prized stallion, securing its halter with practiced fingers. The storm's fury peaked around noon, transforming day into an unnatural twilight. The women worked in near darkness, moving by. 3 days later, John returned from the cattle drive to find his property transformed. Debris littered the yard, and the once sturdy corral stood partially rebuilt with makeshift repairs. But it was the sight of Mary and Sarah that stopped him in his tracks. They stood side by side on the porch, their postures straight despite obvious fatigue. "The horses?" he asked, dismounting with a wary glance toward the barn. "All accounted for," Mary answered, a note of quiet pride in her voice. "Your home weathered the storm. So did we." John surveyed his land, then the two women who had defended it. Something shifted in his expression, respect deepening into something warmer as he nodded once, the simple gesture speaking volumes in his characteristic silence. "Never doubted it would," he finally said, his eyes lingering on Mary's face, finding strength where others had only seen fragility. The whispers began at the general store, where Robert Brown leaned across his counter, voice low but carrying. "That Johnson woman threw herself at John Smith like a desperate animal, begging to be taken in. Makes you wonder what she's really after, doesn't it?" By midweek, the rumors had spread through Copper Bend like wildfire. Mary Johnson felt the stares as she tied her horse outside the store, noticed how conversations hushed when she approached. A woman from church crossed the street rather than greet her, while another whispered behind her hand to a companion. "I heard she promised him anything," the blacksmith's wife said, loud enough for Mary to hear as she passed. The words stung like a physical blow, her cheeks burning as she hurried back to the wagon. That evening, Mary scrubbed the kitchen floor with such force that her knuckles bled. "They think I'm nothing but a beggar," she told Sarah, her voice tight with anger. "That I tricked my way into this home." Her younger cousin paused in brushing down one of the horses. "Since when do you care what those people think?" "I don't," Mary insisted, but the tremble in her hands betrayed her. The hard-won dignity she'd built through weeks of labor felt suddenly fragile. When John returned from checking the northern pasture, he found her still scrubbing, her eyes red-rimmed. He said nothing, simply hung his hat on its peg and began preparing supper, a task usually claimed by Mary. The next morning, William Davis stopped John outside the feed store. "Generous of you, taking in those strays," he remarked with a smirk. "Especially the older one. Pretty enough to make charity worthwhile, I suppose." John's expression never changed, but his knuckles whitened around the reins of his mount. He simply nodded once and continued loading his supplies. That Sunday, he surprised both women by suggesting they all attend church together. Mary hesitated, dreading the whispers, but something in his steady gaze convinced her. They rode side by side into town, John flanking the cousins like a silent guardian. As they entered the small wooden church, he placed Mary's hand in the crook of his arm, a gesture clear to everyone watching. During the service, he shared his hymnal with her, their shoulders touching. When collection came, he handed her the coins to place in the basket, a public display of trust. No words were exchanged about the rumors, not on the ride home, nor during the evening meal. But as they worked together the following dawn, mending a broken fence line, John passed Mary tools without being asked, anticipated her needs before she voiced them. His faith in her was written in actions, not declarations, in shared labor and quiet respect that spoke louder than any gossip. The evening shadows stretched long across the ranch as John Smith trudged back from his daily fence check, his boots heavy with mud and his face carved with concern. He'd found nearly 50 yards of barbed wire sliced clean through on the north boundary, the metal coils hanging uselessly from the posts like broken promises. Mary looked up from the stew she was stirring when the rancher entered, the slam of the door betraying his mood before his expression could. Sarah paused in her mending, needles suspended mid-stitch as she caught the tension radiating from him. "Someone cut the fences," John announced, his voice low and controlled despite the fury simmering beneath. "Not animals, not weather. Someone with wire cutters and purpose." Mary set down her wooden spoon, wiping her hands on her apron. "William Davis?" she asked, recalling the neighboring rancher whose cold eyes had followed them at church last Sunday. John nodded grimly. "Likely. He's been talking up the railroad men, claiming this stretch would make a better route than following the creek bed." He ran a calloused hand through his hair, leaving it standing in tired spikes. "The railroad means money, and Davis has never had enough of that to satisfy him." Sarah moved to the window, peering out as if expecting to see intruders lurking in the twilight. "Will they try to force you off your land?" Her voice carried the edge of someone who understood displacement all too well. For the first time since their arrival, the cousins witnessed something they hadn't seen before: uncertainty in John's steady gaze. The rancher, who had offered shelter without hesitation, now looked vulnerable, the weight of his responsibility visible in the slump of his broad shoulders. "This land isn't just dirt and grass," he said finally, settling heavily into a chair. "It's everything I've built, everything I am." His eyes met Mary's across the table. "Everything I protect." Mary felt something shift inside her chest at his words. This wasn't just about property lines or cattle. This was about belonging, about standing your ground when the world tried to push you aside. Something she understood in her bones. "We'll help repair the fence tomorrow," she said firmly, returning to the stew, but stirring with new purpose. "All three of us." Sarah nodded, her earlier fear transforming into determination. "I can ride out early, check the other boundaries." John looked between them, surprise softening the hard lines of his face. The women who had arrived desperate at his door now stood as allies, not burdens. He gave a single nod, that same gesture that had changed their lives in front of the general store months ago. "We start at dawn," he said simply, but the gratitude in his voice spoke volumes. That night, as wind rattled the windows, Mary realized their fragile arrangement had evolved into something stronger than necessity, a shared purpose that bound them together against whatever threats might come. Robert Brown's wagon appeared on the horizon more frequently as winter tightened its grip on Copper Bend. The store owner would arrive with small packages of sugar or coffee, items that weren't strictly necessary but offered a touch of comfort to the isolated ranch. His visits always seemed timed for when John was occupied with the cattle in the far pasture. "A woman like you deserves better than this hardship," he told Mary one afternoon, his voice soft as he watched her mend a torn shirt on the porch. "My establishment in town has a small apartment above it, clean, warm, safe from the elements." His eyes lingered on her chopped hands, the calluses that had formed where once her skin had been smooth. Mary looked up from her stitching, studying his well-fed face and the polished buttons of his coat. "And what would be expected of me in return for such generosity?" Robert smiled, adjusting his hat. "Just your company, perhaps help in the store. Nothing improper, of course." But the way his gaze traveled over her suggested otherwise. "Think of Sarah, too. A young girl needs stability, education. Not this." He gestured dismissively at the weathered ranch house and the endless prairie beyond. That evening, as wind rattled the windows, Mary found herself weighing his offer. The store would be warm, the work lighter than hauling water and mending fences. No more worrying about predators, animal or human, circling the property while John was away. "He came again today, didn't he?" Sarah asked, brushing down one of the horses. "I saw his wagon tracks." Mary nodded, leaning against the barn door. "He offered us a place in town." "And you're considering it?" The younger woman's voice sharpened. "After everything we've built here?" "Built?" Mary laughed softly. "We're still beggars here, Sarah. Just with more blisters." Sarah set down the brush with deliberate care. "Is that how you see it? I'm not a beggar anymore. I'm earning my keep. The animals trust me now." "And John took us in out of pity," Mary interrupted, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Is that what you think?" Sarah challenged. "Then you haven't been paying attention." Later, Mary stood at the window, watching John return from the fields, his broad shoulders hunched against the cold. He moved with purpose, checking the corral, securing the barn doors against the night wind. There was dignity in his labor, in the life they were piecing together. Robert's offer promised safety, but demanded surrender. Here, despite everything, she was becoming someone she might respect. The choice weighed on her, heavy as the Texas sky. The blizzard howled like a wounded beast, forcing John Smith, Mary Johnson, and Sarah to huddle within the ranch house's wooden walls. For 3 days straight, the wind had piled snow against the doors and windows, turning the modest home into both sanctuary and cage. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across their faces as they sat in uneasy proximity. "Never seen a winter this fierce since '87, John muttered, stoking the flames. His calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency, though tension lined his shoulders. The rancher rarely spoke of his past, but something about the enforced intimacy loosened his tongue. "Lost my parents that year. Pneumonia took Pa first, then Ma just gave up." Mary looked up from her mending, needle paused mid-stitch. "Is that why you live alone? Why you never—" She let the question hang unfinished. "Easier that way," he replied, but his eyes told a different story. No one to disappoint, no one to lose. Outside, the wind screamed louder, rattling the shutters. Sarah paced restlessly by the window, her slender frame silhouetted against the frosted glass. "I can't breathe in here," she whispered, more to herself than to them. "The storm will pass," Mary assured her cousin, though uncertainty tinged her voice. "It's not the storm." Sarah turned, her young face suddenly fierce. "It's this life, following you, following him. When do I get to choose?" The words hung in the air like frost. Mary set down her sewing, hurt flickering across her features. "I never meant to trap you." "You didn't," Sarah softened. "You saved me. But I need more than safety now." John watched the exchange silently, then surprised them both by saying, "My father wanted me to be a blacksmith. I chose this land instead." He gestured to the walls around them. "Choice is all that matters in the end." As night deepened, Mary finally confessed what had been weighing on her. "That day in town, when I grabbed your arm, I wasn't just desperate. I was determined." Her eyes met John's across the room. "I'd tried begging before. It never worked. But I saw something in you, someone who understood survival." The rancher nodded slowly, recognition passing between them. "And I saw someone who wouldn't quit." Sarah watched them, suddenly feeling like an intruder on something intimate. Yet in this frozen moment of honesty, she found her voice too. "I want to train horses, not just tend them, train them, make something of myself." The confession hung in the air, 3 souls laid bare in the firelight, as the storm outside matched the tumult within. For the first time since they'd arrived at the ranch, they weren't just 3 people sheltering from the cold. They were 3 futures intertwined, each one suddenly, startlingly possible. The blizzard descended on Copper Bend with a vengeance, howling winds driving snow sideways against the ranch house windows. John Smith had been checking the barn every hour, concerned about a pregnant heifer due to calve any day. When midnight came with no sign of the storm abating, Mary Johnson insisted on joining him for the next check. "You'll freeze out there," he warned, pulling on his heavy coat. "So will you," Mary replied simply, already wrapping a woolen scarf around her neck. They trudged through knee-deep snow, lantern light barely cutting through the white darkness. Inside the barn, they found chaos. Part of the roof had given way under the weight of ice. And in the corner, the heifer lay on her side, a tiny, wet calf shivering beside her. "The roof won't hold much longer," John shouted over the wind's roar, pointing to the groaning beams overhead. Without hesitation, Mary handed him the lantern and dropped to her knees beside the animals. "Get some blankets from the tack room," she ordered, her voice steady despite the cold seeping through her clothes. For 3 hours they worked in the failing structure, Mary keeping the newborn alive with her body heat, while John reinforced what he could of the damaged roof. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving the ranch blanketed in pristine white. The calf stood on wobbly legs, nudging its mother, while Mary sat exhausted on a hay bale, her hands raw and her face flushed with triumph. Word spread quickly through Copper Bend. Robert Brown mentioned it when townsfolk gathered at his store, his tone surprised as he described how that fragile Johnson girl had outlasted men twice her size during the worst blizzard in years. The women nodded knowingly. They had suspected Mary's strength all along. A week later, Mary was putting away dishes when she noticed John sitting by the fireplace, his back to her. Curious about his unusual stillness, she approached quietly. In his weathered hands, a small wooden horse took shape beneath his knife, each stroke careful and precise. His expression, normally guarded, had softened in concentration. "Who's that for?" Mary asked gently. John started slightly, but didn't hide his work. "Thomas Miller's boy. Lost his leg to infection last month." Mary leaned against the doorframe, watching his big hands move with surprising delicacy over the wood. This was the same man who could break a wild horse, who had faced down drunken troublemakers without flinching. Yet here he sat, creating something beautiful from nothing but scraps and patience. "It's lovely," she said, something warm unfurling in her chest. John merely nodded, but the slight color in his cheeks told her more than words ever could. The ranch had settled into a rhythm of sorts, but beneath the surface, emotions churned like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Sarah Johnson sat alone in the barn, her fingers working a brush through a mare's mane with practiced ease. The horses responded to her touch in ways they never did with others. Yet this gift seemed to go unnoticed lately. "They only talk about Mary now," she whispered to the horse, who nickered softly in response. "Mary saved the calf. Mary fixed the fence. Mary and John this, Mary and John that." The jealousy had been building for weeks. Sarah watched the glances exchanged between her cousin and the rancher, the way their hands would occasionally brush during chores, how they'd fallen into a comfortable silence that spoke volumes. Once inseparable, the cousins now orbited different worlds within the same small ranch. That evening at supper, the tension finally boiled over. "I might as well be invisible," Sarah said, pushing her plate away. "I've broken every horse on this property, but all anyone sees is how Mary braved the storm." Mary looked up, startled. "That's not true. Your work with the horses is—" "Save it," Sarah cut her off. "You two have your own world now. I understand." John cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the raw emotion. "Your work is valued here," he said simply, but the words fell flat against Sarah's hurt. Later that night, Mary woke to find Sarah's bed empty. Panic seized her chest as she searched the house, then the barn, calling her cousin's name into the darkness. John joined the search, his face grim, as they realized Sarah had taken one of the horses and disappeared into the night. "She'll come back," he assured Mary, though his eyes betrayed his worry. Dawn broke with no sign of the young woman. Mary paced the porch, blaming herself for not seeing the depth of Sarah's pain. When a horse's silhouette finally appeared on the horizon, she ran to meet her cousin, relief washing over her. But Sarah wasn't alone. Clutched in her hand were scraps of fabric and a torn leather glove. "It's William Davis," she announced, dismounting with a newfound confidence. "I followed him last night. He's been cutting the fences on the north pasture." She held out the evidence, the torn glove bearing Davis's distinctive stitching and fabric that matched his coat, caught on the barbed wire where he'd been working. John took the items, his expression darkening. "You could have been killed following him alone." "But I wasn't," Sarah replied, her eyes bright with purpose. "You needed proof, and now you have it." Mary embraced her cousin, seeing her not as the girl who needed protection, but as a woman who had found her courage. In that moment, the jealousy between them seemed to dissolve, replaced by something stronger: mutual respect. The railroad surveyor arrived at John Smith's ranch on a crisp morning, his leather satchel bulging with maps and measuring instruments. He tipped his hat politely to Mary, who stood on the porch with arms crossed, watching as the man paced the property, making notes and driving small wooden stakes into the frozen earth. "They want to cut straight through the east pasture," John explained later that evening, his voice tight as he spread the surveyor's map across the kitchen table. "The railway's coming whether we like it or not." Mary leaned over his shoulder, her breath warm against his cheek. "But that's where the best grazing land is. Your cattle, our cattle," John corrected her quietly. The word hung between them, a small acknowledgement of how much had changed since that desperate night in town. The railroad offered compensation, but the amount seemed pitiful compared to what the land meant to them. More than soil and grass, it represented security, independence, a future they'd begun to imagine together. For John, it was the culmination of years of solitary toil. For Mary, it was the first place she'd ever truly belonged. "You could fight it," Mary suggested, her voice stronger now than when she'd first arrived. No longer the woman who'd clutched his sleeve in desperation, she stood tall beside him, a partner rather than a supplicant. John ran a calloused hand through his hair. "Fighting the railroad is like fighting the weather. Some things can't be stopped." "Some things shouldn't be accepted without a battle," she countered, color rising in her cheeks. "Sarah and I didn't come all this way just to watch someone else decide our fate again." Their argument escalated, voices rising and falling like the prairie wind. Sarah slipped away to the barn, uncomfortable with the tension that crackled between them. "This isn't just about you anymore," Mary insisted, slamming her palm against the table. "It's about all of us. I won't be pushed aside when decisions are made." John stared at her, surprise giving way to something warmer. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the frightened creature who'd begged for shelter months ago. Her determination both frustrated and moved him. "I'm not asking permission to have an opinion," she continued, softer now. "I'm telling you I have one." Later, as moonlight spilled across the porch steps where they sat in uneasy silence, John reached for Mary's hand. The touch was tentative, a question rather than a demand. "I've been alone so long," he admitted, "I forgot what it means to consider someone else's thoughts." Mary's fingers tightened around his. "And I've been dependent so long, I never learned to voice my own." Between them, something shifted, respect deepening into a connection neither had anticipated when winter first drove them together. The betrayal came on a Tuesday. John Smith had known Michael Johnson for 15 years. They'd shared meals, mended fences, and once even survived a 3-day blizzard together. But as John stood in the dusty street outside the general store, Michael wouldn't meet his eyes. "The railroad's offering good money, John," Michael said, his hat twisted nervously in his hands. "Progress is coming whether we like it or not. You're fighting a losing battle." John's jaw tightened. So you signed the petition supporting their claim to my land? It wasn't a question. The rancher had seen Michael's signature on the document Robert Brown had proudly displayed in his store window. A roster of Copper Bend citizens who supported the railroad's right to seize property through eminent domain. "I've got family to think about," Michael muttered, still not meeting John's gaze. "The railroad's promising jobs, better prices for cattle. You're being stubborn, like always." John said nothing more, just turned and mounted his horse, the weight of betrayal sitting heavy on his shoulders as he rode back to the ranch. Mary was in the yard when he returned, her sleeves rolled up as she hauled water from the well. One look at his face told her everything. "Michael signed, didn't he?" she asked, setting down the bucket. John nodded once, dismounting with a weariness that seemed to age him 10 years in a moment. "Town meeting's tomorrow. They'll vote on whether to support the railroad's claim." That evening, Sarah found them sitting silently at the kitchen table, a map of the property spread between them. "What happens if they vote against us?" the young woman asked. "We fight," John said simply, "in court if necessary." Mary placed her hand on the map, right over the house they all now called home. "The railroad thinks they can just take what they want because we're just one ranch against their money." "They don't know how stubborn you are," Sarah said with a small smile. The next morning, Mary surprised them both by announcing she would attend the town meeting. "This is my home too," she said firmly, when John raised an eyebrow. "I'm not staying behind." In the crowded church that served as Copper Bend's meeting hall, Mary stood tall, beside John as William Davis spoke passionately about progress and prosperity. Robert Brown caught her eye from across the room, offering a sympathetic smile that suggested he could still provide her shelter if she abandoned this losing cause. Mary turned away from him, her hand finding John's calloused one instead. She wasn't clinging to him now, desperate for protection as she had been that first night. This time, she stood as his equal, her fingers intertwining with his, not from fear, but from choice. "I'm staying," she whispered, "just for him. Not because I need to, because I want to." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the weathered floorboards as winter winds howled outside. John Smith sat hunched at the table, his calloused hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee gone cold. Mary watched him from across the room, the silence between them heavy with unspoken truths. "This land wasn't always mine," he finally said, voice rough as gravel. "Belonged to the Millers. Good folk. 3 children and a dream bigger than their means." Mary moved closer, drawn by the rare vulnerability in his words. The rancher rarely spoke of his past, his history as closely guarded as the boundaries of his property. 4 seasons of drought broke them, John continued. "Watched them lose everything. Cattle dropping dead, crops withering. Bank foreclosed, and I was there at the auction with money I'd saved for 15 years. His eyes met hers, filled with a shame he'd carried like a stone in his pocket. "I bought their suffering for pennies on the dollar, their children crying as I signed the papers." Mary settled beside him, her own cup untouched. "You gave them fair value when no one else would." "Fair?" He shook his head. "Nothing fair about a man losing everything he built. Every time I repair a fence or mend the barn roof, I wonder if I'm just keeping it warm for the next fellow who'll watch me fail." Outside, the wind found new fury, rattling the windows like angry spirits. Mary thought of Copper Bend's whispers about her, the desperate woman who'd attached herself to the silent rancher. The shame burned fresh. "The town thinks I trapped you," she said quietly, "that I saw a man alone and plotted my way into your home." John looked up sharply. "What others think doesn't change what is. Doesn't it?" Mary's laugh held no humor. "Their judgment follows us like shadows. Robert Brown offered me sanctuary again yesterday. Said a woman like me deserved better than a cold ranch and a colder man." Something flashed in John's eyes. Anger, perhaps, or fear. "And what did you tell him?" that I'd rather face honest hardship than gilded chains. She reached across the table, her fingers stopping just short of his. I know what it means to build something from nothing, to fear losing it all in a heartbeat. In that moment, the space between them seemed both vast and insignificant. John's hand moved, rough fingers brushing against hers, tentative, questioning. We're more alike than different, you and I, Mary whispered. The rancher nodded, a gesture as simple as the one that had first brought her to his door, yet weighted with new understanding. In sharing their deepest fears, they had found common ground more solid than the land beneath their feet, a foundation built not on desperation or duty, but on the recognition of kindred spirits. Mary Johnson paced the wooden floor of the ranch house, her shadow dancing against the wall as the oil lamp flickered. The railroad dispute had brought everything to a head: their safety, their future, their very place in Copper Bend. Outside, the Texas wind howled like a wounded animal, matching the turmoil in her heart. I've been thinking, she said, her voice barely audible above the creaking timbers. Perhaps we should marry. John Smith looked up from his chair by the fire, his weathered face unreadable in the dim light. The rancher's hands stilled on the piece of wood he'd been whittling. Not for love, Mary quickly added, her cheeks flushing. For protection, for Sarah's sake too. A woman alone has no standing here, but as your wife. She trailed off, the words hanging between them like smoke. John set down his knife. You don't owe me that, he said, his voice rough from disuse. It's not about owing, she replied. It's about surviving. This world is only kind to the strong, to those with names that mean something. The proposal settled in the room, heavy with duty and unspoken longing. John didn't answer immediately, and Mary didn't press. They'd learned patience from the land. Some seeds needed time before they showed their true nature. In the days that followed, something shifted between them. Mary noticed how John's hand lingered when passing her a cup of coffee at breakfast. He caught her smiling at the way he spoke softly to the horses at dusk. Small moments collected like raindrops, gradually forming something deeper than gratitude or convenience. One evening, Sarah caught them laughing together over a story from John's cattle driving days. The younger woman observed them with knowing eyes before slipping out to the barn, giving them space that once would have been unthinkable. She sees it, Mary said after her cousin had gone. Sees what? John asked, though his eyes told her he already knew. Mary reached across the table, her once soft hands now calloused from ranch work, and placed them over his. The line between what we need and what we want is getting harder to find. The rancher turned his palm upward, his fingers intertwining with hers. This wasn't the desperate grip of that first meeting outside the general store. This was a choice, deliberate and steady. I never thought I'd find anyone who could stand beside me, not behind me, John admitted. Not after everything. Mary nodded, understanding the weight of his words. What had begun as a bargain for shelter had transformed into something neither could have anticipated when she'd clutched his sleeve that October evening. So, she asked, is that a yes to my proposal? John's rare smile broke across his face like dawn over the prairie. I believe it is. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a breathless boy from town. John Smith unfolded the yellow paper with calloused hands, his weathered face revealing nothing as his eyes scanned the message. Only when he looked up did Mary catch the flicker of relief in his gaze. The railroad's changing course, he announced, voice steady despite the weight lifting from his shoulders. They're running the tracks 3 miles south, through the old Wilson property. Mary's hands flew to her mouth, a small gasp escaping her lips. After months of uncertainty, threats, and sleepless nights, their home was safe. The ranch would remain untouched by the iron rails that had promised to slice their world in two. Word spread quickly through Copper Bend. By nightfall, the saloon was alive with speculation about land values and changing fortunes. Some celebrated, others cursed their luck. The church bells rang that evening, competing with raucous laughter from the drinking establishment as the town divided itself between those who saw providence and those who saw missed opportunity. Back at the ranch, the celebration was quieter. John uncorked a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving, pouring 3 modest glasses. They sat on the porch, watching twilight paint the prairie in shades of purple and gold. "To staying put," he toasted, the normally taciturn rancher, allowing himself a rare smile. Sarah sipped her drink, her eyes distant. "Not everyone will be staying," she said softly. The words hung in the air between them. With the immediate threat gone, the question that had been pushed aside now demanded an answer. The cousins had come seeking temporary shelter during that desperate October evening. Now, with spring approaching and the ranch secure, what would keep them tethered to this place? Mary watched a hawk circle lazily overhead, her thoughts churning. She had arrived as a beggar, transformed into a worker, and now stood as something else entirely. Someone who belonged on this land as surely as the cottonwoods along the creek. But Sarah's restlessness was palpable, a living thing between them. "This doesn't have to be everyone's home forever," Mary said finally, reaching for John's hand, his fingers intertwined with hers, work-roughened skin against work-roughened skin. The rancher nodded, understanding flowing between them without words. The land had taught them all that belonging wasn't about ownership or obligation. It was about choice. Every morning, they chose to face the sun together, to shoulder the work side by side. As darkness settled over the prairie, the 3 sat in companionable silence. Tomorrow would bring decisions, but tonight they had this moment. 3 souls bound not by desperation anymore, but by something far stronger that had grown in its place. Sarah Johnson stood in the doorway of the barn, her silhouette framed by the golden light of sunset. The young woman who had once cowered behind her cousin now carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her purpose. Her hands, once soft and uncertain, were now calloused from rope and reins, testament to countless hours spent with the horses that had become her passion. "I've been offered a position in Oak Ridge," she announced over supper, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "The Wilsons need someone who understands horses, and they're willing to pay fair wages." John set down his fork, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. Mary reached across the table, her fingers briefly touching her cousin's hand. "When would you leave?" Mary asked, pride and sorrow mingling in her voice. "End of the month," Sarah replied. "It's only 20 miles. Not so far that I can't visit." That night, John stood on the porch, staring at the distant hills. Mary joined him, the wooden boards creaking beneath her feet. The rancher had grown accustomed to her presence, finding comfort in the shared silence that had once been his only companion. "She reminds me of you," he said finally. "Same determination." Mary smiled, remembering the desperate woman who had clutched his sleeve in Copper Bend all those months ago. "I was just trying to survive then. She's choosing her path." "Because of you," John replied. "You showed her how." The following days passed in a flurry of preparation. Mary helped Sarah pack her few belongings, adding small treasures she'd saved from her own meager possessions. A hair ribbon, a small mirror, a book of poetry they'd found in town. "I never thought I'd be the one staying behind," Mary confessed as they folded clothes together. "When we first came here, I was planning our escape." Sarah laughed, the sound bright and unfettered. "And now?" Mary glanced toward the window where John could be seen mending a saddle. "Now I've found where I belong." On Sarah's last evening at the ranch, John presented her with a gift, a beautifully crafted leather bridle, the workmanship finer than anything they'd seen in the general store. "Every good horse trainer needs proper tools," he said simply. As they watched Sarah test the supple leather between her fingers, Mary felt John's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long familiarity. What had begun as an act of mercy had transformed into something neither had dared hope for, a partnership forged through shared hardship and mutual respect. "Thank you," Mary whispered, not just for the moment, but for everything that had led them here. John squeezed her hand in response, his silence more eloquent than words. Spring arrived with the scent of wildflowers and distant train whistles, a new era blooming across Copper Bend. The Texas prairie transformed, shedding its winter harshness as patches of bluebonnets dotted the landscape surrounding John Smith's ranch. The morning air carried both promise and change, much like the lives of those who had weathered the brutal winter together. John stood on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the horizon gold. No longer the solitary figure who had once tied his horse outside the general store. He now moved with the certainty of a man who had found his purpose beyond the land itself. His calloused hands, once known only for their strength, now carried the memory of gentle touches and shared burdens. Mary joined him each dawn, her shoulders squared with hard-earned confidence. The desperate woman who had clutched his sleeve in town was unrecognizable in this steady partner, who matched him stride for stride across the ranch. She had transformed their arrangement of necessity into something neither had dared hope for, a partnership of equals, forged in the crucible of frontier hardship. "The North pasture needs attention," she remarked one morning, her voice carrying the authority that had once belonged solely to him. John nodded, a smile touching the corners of his mouth. Their conversations had evolved from terse instructions to the comfortable shorthand of two people who had learned to read each other's silences. They received a letter from Sarah every month, each page filled with tales of her success as a horse trainer in the neighboring town. The young woman who had once hidden behind her cousin now commanded respect with her remarkable skill with even the most difficult animals. Her independence was bittersweet for them both, a testament to their success and a reminder of change. The railroad that had threatened everything ultimately brought new life to Copper Bend. Occasionally, they would spot Robert Brown in town, his gaze sliding away when Mary approached. William Davis had sold his land and moved west, his schemes forgotten as the community grew stronger. One evening, as they sat together, watching the sunset, John reached for Mary's hand. "I never thought I'd be grateful for a desperate plea in the street," he said quietly, the words carrying the weight of all they had built together. Mary's fingers tightened around his. "And I never thought desperation would lead me home," she replied. The ranch stood as testament to their journey, not just a shelter from the elements, but the foundation of a life neither had imagined possible. In this untamed corner of Texas, where mercy had once seemed a luxury, they had proven that belonging was not given, but built, day by day, choice by choice, season by season.